Hello, so today we are going to be trying to write equations of sine or cosine graphs by using their key features on a graph. So you'll be given the graph and then you're going to try to start from scratch and write an equation about it. So we're going to get started on that. So here's our first graph, and keep in mind that, like I said, we're going to want to identify the key features. So we're going to need the amplitude, the period, any phase shift that it may have, and the midline. And so starting with just the midline, because that's always the easiest one to find because you're just looking at the average of the max and the min. And in this one, you can tell it's kind of centered just around the x-axis. And so that midline is just going to be y equals 0. And then for the phase shift, you're just going to look at like where the graph starts. So on this one, it's starting at the origin. And so we're going to say there's no phase shift. And then we need to look at the amplitude and the period. So let's do the amplitude first. So the amplitude is going to be the distance from a max or from a min to the midline. So on this one, I believe the distance between them is going to be the 3 right here. And so the amplitude is going to be 3. And then the period is where a lot of people get a little bit more confused. But we're just going to start at the beginning and go up to our maximum and come back down. And then whenever we get back down to this point here, we have to kind of look and see what else is going on. So we know that there's another piece that's below the x-axis that we need to include. So we're going to go ahead and grab, I drew that really badly. But we're going to go ahead and grab this piece as well. So now we started at the midline, we went up to the maximum, came down to the minimum, and went back to the midline. And when we get back to the midline, if you look at where it's going at that point, it's gonna go back up to the maximum again. And we've already done that one time, so we don't need to do it again. So the period is gonna end right there at pi. So that gives us all of our different key features on here. And so then from there, you just need to write an equation. So we would have y equals, and the first thing we need is the amplitude, which is 3. And then we started at the midline, so we're going to write a sine equation. And then our b value is going to be 2 pi divided by the period. And so then in this case, the pi's are just going to cancel out, so b is going to be 2. And then we have x in parentheses. There's no phase shifts, so I don't need to add or subtract anything to that. And then the midline is at 0, so it would just be like plus 0. So you don't really have to add anything at the end either. You can just leave it as y equals 3 sine 2x. So then here's another graph here, and we're going to do basically the same thing we just did. So I want the amplitude, the period, the phase shift, and the midline. So since we've already done one example, why don't you try pausing it and seeing if you can write the equation, and then unpause it when you're ready to see it gone over. So I'm going to start with the midline again because it's the easiest to find, and this one, just like the last one, is going to be centered around the x-axis. So our midline is going to be y equals 0 again. The phase shift, it starts at the origin again, and so sine always starts at the origin, so we're going to say that there's no phase shift again. The amplitude, so the distance from the maximum down to that midline, is going to be 2 in this one because that highest point is 2. And then for the period, we are going to go up to the maximum, down to the minimum, and then back to the midline. And that's going to give us the whole period for this one. And so that ends at 4 pi. Oops. So we're going to get that written in there. And so then at that point, we're going to go ahead and write our equation. So we have y equals a, which is the amplitude, times the sine of b, which is going to be 2 pi divided by 4 pi. So our pi's are going to cancel, and then 2 over 4 is going to equal 1/2. So we would have sine of 1/2 times x, and then there's no phase shift, so there's nothing to add in there with the x, and then the midline is at 0, so you would leave it like this. So then my last example is the exact same graph that I just had on the last slide, but it adds something that asks us to try to write it as a cosine equation. So the main thing that we said is a difference between sine and cosine is that cosine is going to start at the maximum. So in this one on the graph, since it starts at the origin instead of the maximum, we're going to have to play around with it a little bit more than we did on the last slide. So our amplitude is still going to be 2 because we still have the same distance from the maximum to the midline. Our period is still going to be 4 pi because you're still going like up to the max, down to the min, and back up to the midline. So that's not going to affect the period either. And then the midline is still going to be at the origin, or on the x-axis, y equals 0. So the thing that is going to change is our phase shift. So I'm going to erase what I have on the graph so that I can show a little bit better. So normally cosine is going to start at the maximum. So our maximum, if you look on the graph, is right here. So that means that one full period for cosine would go from the max down to the min and then back up to the max. So it would look more like that. It's going to be the same distance as the 4 pi, but this is how it would look more like that. So what we need to do, since cosine starts at the maximum, is we need this to be the place where the graph starts. So basically what happens if you're writing it as a cosine equation, then this point here has been shifted over to the right from our y-axis, which is where we would normally want the graph to start. So that means there was a phase shift to the right, and it was by pi units. And so for our phase shift, we're going to say that it was shifted right by pi. And so then I'm going to write my equation from that. So I would have y equals 2 times the cosine of b, which is 2 pi over 4 pi, which we said on the last slide was 1/2. So cosine of 1/2 times x, and then it shifts right by pi, so I need to put minus pi in there with the parentheses with the x, and then the midline is y equals 0. So I don't have to add anything to the end, but in that one you would have to do a phase shift just because the graph doesn't start on that y-axis, on the y-axis like we want it to. So then I just want to do one more because all the rest of them have had a midline at y equals 0. So I want to do one that doesn't have that. So we're still going to be looking for amp, period, phase shift, and midline. And I'm going to start with the midline. And so this one is centered around right here. And so our midline on this one is going to be y equals -3. So that one is going to be different from the ones that we've done in the past just because it's not going to have there's going to be some type of shift for the midline. So I just wanted to do one that had something like that. So then for the amplitude, the distance from the maximum to the midline is going to be the distance between -1 and -3. So that's just going to be 2. And then for the period, we're going to start right here where x equals 0, and we're going to go to the maximum, down to the minimum, and back to the midline. And then that's where it restarts by going up to the max, down to the min, and all of that all over again. So our period on this one is going to be 2. And our phase shift, since it starts at the midline, we can say none, and we just need to write it as a sine equation. So I would have y equals our a value, which is 2, times the sine of b, which is 2 pi divided by the period, which is 2. And so our 2's are going to cancel, and we're just going to have pi there. So pi, and then our x, and then we don't have a phase shift, so we are going to close our parentheses. And then the midline just means we're going to put the -3 on the end. So in all the other ends, we didn't have to add anything to the end because the midline was at 0. But on this one, since it's at -3, we just have to put that -3 at the end. So basically, as you're trying to write these equations, you just need to really make sure that you are finding each of these features first, so the amplitude, period, phase shift, and midline, and that should help you out when you're trying to go through and write the equations for each of these graphs.